Hello, and today we're going to be looking at why has the British nuclear deterrent been so controversial. So, let's first look at the arguments in favour of a British nuclear deterrent. So, the Labour government in the late 1940s decided to build a nuclear bomb, as before the NATO treaty was signed in 1949, they feared that the US would be unwilling to defend Europe and that a nuclear weapon would deter the USSR, whose forces were considerably larger than that of Western Europe. The British nuclear deterrent contributes to the defence of Western Europe, that was West, and the independent possession of Britain's nuclear deterrent maintains Britain's great power status. So now let's hear the arguments against the British nuclear deterrent. So since 1962, when Macmillan persuaded President Kennedy to supply Britain with Polaris missiles to carry British warheads, the British nuclear deterrent has not been independent, but it's been reliant on the Americans. The British nuclear deterrent is virtually irrelevant when measured against the size of the American and Russian arsenals. And there are heavy costs in maintaining reducing government investment in other areas, such as education and conventional forms of defence. So nuclear weapons as an issue in British domestic politics from 1950s to 1960s. So during the late 1950s and early 1960s, lots of pressure groups grew for nuclear weapons to be abandoned to make the world safer. So in 1958, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, also known as the CND, which began a series of annual marches on the nuclear weapons plant at I'm not going to try and say that, in Berkshire, then to Trafalgar Square in London. In a march in 1960, it attracted as many as 100,000 protesters. However, supporters maintained that Britain needed to look strong to prevent Soviet aggression. The Labour Party was extremely divided on the issue, with the Bevernites on the left of the party who advocated for disarmament, to the more centrists of the Labour Party who argued to keep weapons. Eventually this would lead to Nye Bevan leaving the Labour Party in 1953. Britain and international agreements on nuclear technology. In 1963, Britain joined the USA and USSR, banning nuclear testing in space, underwater and in the atmosphere. Britain also signed the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferatory Treaty, with the signatories agreed not to give nuclear technology to other countries. Because of the insignificant size of a nuclear arsenal, Britain didn't play a large role in the signing of the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaties, also known as SALT, in 1927 and 1979. So British nuclear weapons in the 80s. Britain's role in nuclear warfare became controversial again in the 80s. During the mid-70s, the USSR set up the SS-20 intermediate-range missiles, which were capable of hitting anywhere in Europe. In 1979, NATO powers agreed to deploy US intermediate-range cruise missiles in response, obviously, to an increasing likelihood of Europe being a nuclear battleground, and a group of women set up a protest camp at Greenham Common in 1981 to demonstrate the opposition of US missiles on UK bases. The camp lasted for almost 20 years. So one woman who was not happy with the Greenham Common protests was Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. She was becoming increasingly concerned about President Reagan's cooperation with Gorbachev to embrace the zero option, which would have been the complete abolishment of nuclear weapons. She also believed the abolition of nuclear forces would leave Europe open to the conventional forces of the USSR, which were much larger than NATO. Although the zero option wasn't adopted the collapse of the USSR in 1991 did lead to agreements by which both USA and Russia reduced their nuclear arsenal. So, at the end of the century, Britain's nuclear policy remained much like its foreign policy, normally independent, but in reality dependent on the USA. So a debate is still continuing on the costs, ethical issues and viability of the nuclear option. Thank you for watching, and if you've made it this far, please subscribe. It only takes 2 minutes and it helps us.